Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today we're going to be talking about an aspect of AI that we haven't really dug into, which is what's necessary to really develop effective data capacity and capabilities. And to discuss that with me today, I have Jesse Robbins, General Partner at Heavybit, but more importantly, one of the founders at Chef. He really started the DevOps movement that we know today and built a lot of early internet infrastructure. Jesse, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on, and especially as we look at I guess a world in which organizations are really wrestling with not only the nuts and bolts of use cases for AI, but a lot of the fundamental pieces of how do you actually build capabilities to be able to leverage it. We're just back from KubeCon, or I was there last week, and I was surprised at, I guess, the amount of sort of prepackaged, yep, all you have to do is bolt up here and you'll have, bright, shiny AI capabilities. And there's just, there's so much when we look at what we're talking to our clients about, so many of the challenges that we see, so much of what we're thinking about, effective AI capabilities, so many enterprises are wrestling with how they actually move forward, whether or not it's identifying what they've got for data resources, figuring out what they really need for capabilities to underpin all this. But I guess one of the things that you've been talking about is really taking a big step backwards and thinking about really what the process of delivering data and supporting it with AI environments is all about. But I guess, can you give our listeners a little bit of background about, what you've been digging into and some of your thoughts about what are ways to approach this?
Sure. So years ago, when we were sort of starting, what became the DevOps movement, Tim O'Reilly wrote this article, and it was basically operations is the new secret sauce. And that was sort of my inspiration and call to action, which ultimately led me to, create the Velocity Conference with O'Reilly and then, the DevOps movement, and then found Chef and sort of, what we think of as currently the now dominant concept in, how organizations build and scale. And about 18 months ago, it became really clear to me that historically, the data people and the infra and platform people have, been friends, but I would say, one group is sort of extroverted, and the, data people have always seemed a little bit more introverted. And what I observed was they were having a moment where suddenly this new data pipeline that emerges. And so kind of I've been taking the position that, just like with the beginning of DevOps, operations is the new secret sauce. The data pipeline is now the new secret sauce for, building and scaling AI-powered applications. And probably the single biggest insight that I've been able to glean living, just a little bit in the future is we're about to see a pretty big shift to, AI applications for organizations are fundamentally the output of training data, of testing, of tuning, of aligning. And, that is basically the new production pipeline, right? So if you're, used to continuous integration and delivery, or if you're like me, where you've been doing it for a long time, or if, your organization is sort of just finally getting there, the pattern that I now believe is going to be part of the regular application testing, build, test, deploy lifecycle is this new data-focused pipeline for producing, training, tweaking, deploying, monitoring, scaling, growing these fundamentally new applications that are part of the new app stack. And so that's kind of been my kick for the past 6 months, has been really trying to understand kind of what the cool new stuff that's happening is, and also sort of helping accelerate it along by pointing this out as widely as I can.
Well, and this is really, these are fundamentally new patterns as opposed to a lot of the, hey, we're trying to get the two teams to work together, the why can't the ranchers and the farmers just be friends kind of thing. This is more than the silo busting piece. This is, as I'm all too fond of saying on this podcast, it's raising the level of abstraction.
That's right.
It's thinking about data as one of those fundamental commodities in the pipeline that you've got to be able to integrate. and that it has a life cycle all of its own, as opposed to, I think, what we hear a lot of is people get very focused on, we've got to get the data, and thinking of it as a static environment. And I think that's a byproduct of the fact there's so much focus on training right now. And people see that as a discrete activity, as opposed to part of the process that is going to be this much larger overall life cycle of what not only the application, but also thinking about the data as part of the life cycle of this environment.
Yep, I completely agree. And if you look at sort of I think, every enterprise, every, organization is going through a moment that really mirrors the migration to cloud, and with it sort of new models and new capabilities as we sort of shrink. For me, like everything that the DevOps movement was really all about fundamentally was time to value, right? Like you have all these teams doing different things, and it just takes a really long time, or it took a really long time to write software and then get it deployed and then have the value unlocked for, the organization that you're working with and the goals you're trying to achieve. And I think that's precisely what's happening in the data pipeline. You have organizations that are saying, oh, we've got all this data. They've been collecting it. They've been, doing things for a long time. And now what we're saying is, if you're a large scale enterprise and you're, trying to ask better questions or have better answers, or, more real-time data, or, some other piece, the speed from which you're able to generate and improve and offer, this new type of information service, that's going to be the strategic advantage, right? So if you've got an organization that says, we've got, a terabyte of blah, blah, blah training data, and it takes us, 12 to 18 months to do anything useful with it. Well, if you take a similar organization with the same training data and they can iterate and deploy and tune and update, a day or a week, that organization is going to, have a likely dramatic advantage simply because they're able to ask better questions, get better answers, and that shortened time really is a strategic advantage. And so that's kind of why I keep drawing these analogies. Similarly, with the continuous delivery kind of moment where it was like, let's deploy lots, code multiple times a day, as opposed to maybe a couple times a year. And that just changes the world that you end up living in, which, is why that has been so successful. We're going to see exact same thing for data pipelines, whether it's proprietary data, whether it's, feedback that you're getting from, performance in the models. But time to value is the one thing that I think every single leader, builder, certainly in the founders that I'm talking to, but more importantly, the enterprise and large scale customers that are trying to figure out what they're going to do with what they have. For me, it's more important that you're able to move quickly, tune, and improve than it is to like get things right in this kind of big training moment. So yeah, completely agree.
But this is a little bit more than just simply reducing the cost of and risk of iteration. This is something, because if you think about the CD kind of value pieces, what we were really doing was taking a lot of activities that organizations already understood, they just didn't do very well or efficiently, and had more often than not loaded with so much risk because they iterated so slowly that each iteration was a significant risk event. And so getting to a point at which you were smoothing the speed with which you could iterate was great. This is really shifting that focus to a set of skills on the data side that in many cases, organizations really haven't had a real understanding about how to deal with data. The data was the thing that fed the app guys. And we had calls that got us data, but yet the data piece wasn't really integrated. This is really shifting into a very different landscape in terms of both an understanding of what that data is and how it gets leveraged, but in ways that organizations typically haven't had to really navigate in terms of an understanding of data.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think perhaps the comfort or clarity I'm trying to offer in the analogy or the comparison is simply helping people understand that what we are doing is a cultural shift in an organization that most organizations now understand, and certainly as an industry we now understand, which is speed of iteration. Being able to do things quickly and iterating faster is a strategic advantage that sort of everyone has to have. The skill set required to do that definitely is an entirely new set of skills, an entirely new set of tools. And there is a lot of, frankly, white space, open opportunity because, to your point, the tools themselves that we, have been using so far, everyone's going to continue to use on the, data app and infra side. But for this training, managing, the entire data pipeline is essentially new. And it's new because it's being used in different ways at larger scale by more people in an organization. And so I definitely agree. Like we're starting from a well understood pattern, but we're applying it to a new space with, often people that have been doing this sort of thing for a while, but it hasn't been a strategic focus. And now literally every organization is going to have this part of a capability and understanding. Every, person at any point in their career now needs to deal with the fact that data isn't a thing that your application uses. Data is your application. And
that transition is not a simple one for many organizations. I guess actually at certain levels, this is, we think about that change in thinking that's required. It really is a much more basic transition. I'm, with my security hat on, I keep thinking about all of the wrestling we've done for years and years and years with trying to get better at grappling with data security issues. And so much of that is exactly what you're identifying. It's getting people beyond thinking that data is that separate thing. And now beginning to understand not only what the data is, but getting around that abstraction of thinking about data as a separate independent entity, and actually the fact that it's integrated into the way in which not only the business operates, but specifically the application environment operates and gets built. I guess what are ways in which you see organizations being able to start to address that shift? And how do you move from what is that traditional model? What are ways in which organizations can start thinking about this differently, and maybe entrees to that to get them into a better pattern?
So the first thing that we're seeing pretty reliably with enterprises, and we see it within our customers of my own portfolio and the companies that we talk to, and then the CEOs and CIOs and CTOs that we talk to on the other side, who are leading organizations that are kind of embracing this, right? And the first thing is there's, I think, a very healthy fear of essentially leaking data, particularly when you're like, okay, well, we're going to upload all of the email that we have in our organization to a new service and, let them train on that in order to be able to ask better.
Why worry, right?
Yeah, right. Like what could possibly go wrong, right? And so, literally, I think every organization that understands and values the both strategic value of the knowledge and information that they've collected, but also understands the very complicated set of risks and challenges where, unlike in the past, if you generate or train a model or develop a RAG or a graph, some other fine-tuning piece, you have created an artifact that now has some degree, we won't call it of understanding, but certainly has the ability to, recreate and show information that might be proprietary or critical or whatever. And so when I say like, this is one of those challenges where iteration is really helpful, what I'm seeing first and foremost with organizations is they're starting kind of small initially and getting used to kind of bootstrapping that pipeline so that they're able to say, okay, well, we want to make sure that only the right information is going into a model or is being used to enhance that model, number one. And number two, the stakeholders that are required simply to put things in order to build these new categories of application, really are a lot more complicated than they were before, because you're now generating basically a copy of that critical information and those relationships within what you share. So like doing appropriate stakeholder review, becomes really complicated from the beginning. And then like you're developing this new kind of capability. So from our standpoint, what I tend to see is we see organizations starting with kind of hosted inferencing models and kind of these very, lightweight things, and then going through really an existential sort of set of questions around like, do we feel comfortable sharing this information with OpenAI or, Google or Anthropic or, whatever. And that process right now, which basically is the, human and legal factors that go into generating a data set, is where a lot of companies kind of get stuck. And what I'm seeing people that are doing that seem to be quite successful is they focus on that rapid iteration time, and then they really spend the time to understand basically this kind of version control around the data sets themselves, so that they're able to say, at the first attempt at fine tuning, we're building a model against our data to be able to answer the following questions. We put this information in and we're able to test and see it's giving good answers coming out. And they're able to then grow that over time rather than sort of having to make it as this huge, massive upfront decision. And so that seems to be the successful pattern, which is, start small, iterate, and build organizational comfort. We're seeing, I see less success in kind of, let's push the entire data lake into a training model and just sort of let everyone sort it out. That seems to be much more fraught. It's harder to kind of get things right early on. It's harder to build those guardrails early on. And it's harder to engage the right stakeholders so that you can both make progress and actually get things deployed into, early test and production.
Well, yeah, you hit on what is one of the big challenges, I think, from an organizational perspective, is because they come from the land of big data, and for so long we had this idea that you should put it all in the data lake or whatever, and we're gonna that then is the repository for all of the data things. And there wasn't really an understanding to know the nature of the data, to be able to deal with it in some better way. And I think, of course, a lot of that early AI hype didn't help. The idea that now we've got something that'll deal with all of the unstructured data, so all you have to do is feed it into the AI, and hey, wow, aren't we awesome? And so that, I think, led to a certain amount of thinking that all you had to do was pour the stuff in, and a nice, pure filtered water would come out the other side. And yeah, not as easy as that. I guess in thinking, for all of those that are stuck in that middle ground, who are still in the the legal quagmires of should we even think about this? Is there a call to action? Is there a significant motivating force that can get them to rethink this? I mean, you're a firefighter. It's so much of this. Yeah, I think in a lot of technology pieces, if we look at sort of the dumpster fire that the development process for many organizations was in the past, is there a parallel to this that can be drawn in similar kind of ways to be able to get organizations to really understand what the nature of this issue is? Because it's so many of them have gotten stuck in these ruts, and it's something where we really need to get pulled out of this. And I don't know. It seems like there's so much that needs to happen there.
So the thing that surprised me was when I was at the NVIDIA conference at the beginning of the year, and Jensen comes out and basically announces the new architecture, and 30,000 people screaming, like it's a rock concert, and I'm like, wow, you guys are cheering unbelievably for what turns out to be us deploying mainframes again, right, on-prem in these controlled environments.
Right, because it's a great big honking DGX, and it's like, hey, now we have great centralized compute. Again, what could go wrong?
So I mean, honestly, I think that the good news is we've spent a lot of time working on who owns your data, what are the boundaries around that. Like, we've gotten pretty good at protecting data in these kind of complex deployment environments. So organizations and we're in this delay period where all of the spending that went into, or that is going into to inferencing infrastructure, training infrastructure, and these kind of massive scale out build outs, there's a delay while it's all getting installed and people are learning how to do this again, and et cetera. And what's happening during this interesting delay is that people are experimenting and building these kind of earlier, smaller models. But the truth is that I think we're still 6 to 12 months out from seeing large organizations throwing lots of GPU in environments that they control with their most critical and strategic data, but I think that's been the solve for most enterprises at scale with resources, which has been we either trust the cloud providers that we're working with enough, or we're willing to invest in our own infrastructure for cost and other benefits. But I think that's sort of the one side. The other part of that and this is pretty central to my own investing thesis at the moment. I really believe in the power of small models deployed locally or at the edge. I led an investment in Continue, Continue.dev, which is the sort of leading open source code assistant. And part of that, the secret there is, they've got just an extraordinary number of users and people coming on all the time. And, we see customers who are in very large organizations or even very restricted, regulated, or secure environments. And the driver for them, and kind of this thing around like OLAMA and, all these local models really, really, really is, let's just see what we're able to do locally first and see, you take a local model plus a graph database with a bunch of context, and you're able to get quite a lot of power available to you and ask a lot of really great questions right away without, having to worry about it, where your data is going or, how it's being used, because it's in that local controlled environment, on your desktop or your laptop or in your team environment. And that to me is actually the thing that's happening now and happening a lot faster. And I think that at least for this current wave of innovators and early leaders, that this is the new trick is, just run it locally. And you solve a lot of those other problems. It creates some new ones. Like most of the large enterprises I know, their developer workstations that they have are, not running massive GPUs. And so, we're seeing right now like Dell and HP rushing to get, much beefier GPU equipped laptops in their developer hands. Meanwhile, Apple's coming out with, the M4 Pro Max or M4 Max, which is just incredible, right? So I think that we're going to see a lot of this work get done locally in local compute environments on, your individual desktops. And that is the workaround at the initial stages. But actually, I think it's the most common pattern, which is we just distribute it at the edge and we use these massive machines for challenges that require, much larger, complex memory environments that, simply won't fit on a laptop or a desktop.
You mean you shouldn't be throwing trillion parameter models at everything? What?
I mean, you can. There's no reason not to, other than it's just, other than physics and, the heat death of the universe. But like, yes, you don't need a trillion parameter. I mean, that's been the big surprise. I've been doing most of my development locally in VS Code with the Continue plugin, running OLAMA against it, and it's changed my entire my own personal software workflow pretty profoundly. And I definitely check against the hosted models, and there are things that they do that are better. But basically, a few weeks later, after some major release comes out, the open source models catch up or exceed the large hosted models for things like writing code or kind of these other environments. And then you get this local training that is like, well, this is how we write software at my company, but that's more of a grammar or a dialect or an accent. It does not need a trillion parameter model in order to, improve your structured process.
Well, and it's that focus, I mean, on so many different levels. As our listeners know, I was out in Abu Dhabi a few weeks ago talking about the challenges with energy growth driven by AI. So not only sort of good for the planet kind of things, but this is really getting back to what was, it seems to me, really some of the fundamental pieces about DevOps, which was the ability to look at much smaller, more directed capabilities and leverage, just do the small localized change, understand what the localized environment really requires, because that's really where that value should be, and leverage those capabilities. And you win not only from not having to wrangle these great massive environments, but also being able to be much better in control of the data, because now you're not sucking in the entire universe to train. You're actually focusing on the data that you need to accomplish the results that you're trying to achieve. So, well, and thinking about this, and just some thoughts to wrap with, what do you think about ways in which organizations should really start to move forward, and how they can raise their level of thinking to really put these kinds of abstractions to work when they think about data?
Yeah. So I think probably the most important first thing is we are going to see really heterogeneous environments that combine lots of different models, providers, and training data sets as the default. So no organization is going to have one magic, perfect, end-all, be-all solution. So if you're trying to figure out, like, how are we going to get started, my advice is start small. If it is possible to, start with local development and local models, and use that as kind of your experimentation and training starting point, because it's safe, it's easy, it's very inexpensive compared to, kind of these big things that need to be right. And then build up an organizational capability around, like, well, this is the application we're trying to build. This is how we're going to improve it. This is the data that needs to go into it that we have today. And this is the process and workflow we're going to do to constantly improving that, delivering that into our test environments that we're then evaluating against, and then putting it into production where we're able to monitor it and make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So that's kind of that standard DevOps and continuous delivery lifecycle, but with the data pipeline. The biggest thing is that most of the crazy innovation that we're seeing that's successful right now is happening frequently local first, or in much smaller cases, while you're figuring out these much larger things. The second thing is recognizing that right now in the space broadly, because everything is changing so fast, and that in particular models are changing fast and getting smaller and more specialized, that kind of models the way that we build internet services, right? Like, what we don't want is these big monolithic single solutions. We want much more localized, smaller, trustable functions that are easier to test and comprehend and understand. And generating those is going to require the cooperation of a bunch of teams that, historically we've kind of had this big data lake model, and then, put as much as you can in there and then pull as much out as possible. And what we're going to see is really specialization around, smaller questions with more precise answers that go into training, better models and fine-tuning approaches, where that is really part of the application lifecycle. That's probably, the biggest thing that at least where I sit, which is kind of in the future, I think is the way that, every successful organization is going to find themselves, which is sort of the mainframe style use cases are still going to be really critical, where, you're going to have that trillion parameter model that, is absolutely doing some special magic. But for the most part, we're still going to see small pieces loosely joined that are easier and easier to build and manage and understand, observe, all of those elements that, organizations actually know how to do today. And the primary difference is that the data itself is what is helping to generate the application as much as the underlying code. I really encourage people to look at these open source, local first models. And, if you're making IT or infrastructure decisions, you should definitely be expecting to spend a lot more on your developer environments where they're getting the, on-device inferencing and GPU stuff, so that, they're able to experiment without running up these enormous bills, but also, the security benefits that you get by experimenting and running locally in a safe environment that's really well understood before you're, dealing with an entirely new category of kind of data migration into these other environments. And, if you had asked me 2 years ago how I thought this was going to go, I was pretty skeptical that we would be doing this on device. And it has turned out that it's just absolutely clear that the edge models are the primary way that people are going to be doing a lot of development. And it's not just because, you have local control, it's that it's easier to iterate and manage and to work within your existing security framework and kind of data framework. So there's lots of really cool stuff happening. Obviously, I'm an investor in a company called Continue, but there's, many open source frameworks that are sort of trying to figure this out. There's OLAMA, which and there's things like LM Studio and a bunch of others that are kind of enabling this lightweight local development movement. And I'm just very, very excited to see kind of how that expanding as we're seeing the large scale Copilot approaches that you're getting through Microsoft and GitHub and kind of that larger ecosystem of players also with not just OpenAI but Anthropic and Mistral and Google with the Gemini elements. So I think that I guess the kind of closing point is expect that people are going to want to work with the best available tools. Those are going to change constantly, and we're definitely going to see a heterogeneous environment that combines the best of these kind of large, massive models that require a huge data infrastructure on the one side, but on the other, we're going to see an incredible proliferation of local, secure, and on-device environments that are going to enable really rapid innovation starting today.
Well, that really brings us full circle. It gets us right back to iterate small, manage risk, and be able to innovate quickly because what today is going to be changing tomorrow. Well, this has been great, Jesse. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me, and I can't wait to be on again sometime soon.
More than welcome to have you back. It's certainly a lot more to talk about, but we are at time, and that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Ron Mudation, Kira Smith on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. Please keep in mind that statements made by persons who are not S&P Global Market Intelligence employees represent their own views and not necessarily the views of S&P Global Market Intelligence. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about ethical AI use, and thoughts about targeting and data in a few use cases. Hopefully it'll be interesting. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.